Greetings, friends and countrymen. Welcome to Conspiracy Corner News, episode 36. This is Bart Sabrell. Conspiracy Corner News briefly highlights the week's most significant and underreported news events throughout the world, focusing on special preparation for the difficult times ahead for all mankind. Thank you again to all my PayPal donators out there, Simon and John, Brett, Andy, James and Ralph, Joseph, Patricia, Graham, Adam, Romerico, Chris, Robert, Russ, Donald, Golden T, Snowman, and Elaine. And of course, the Sleuth Journal, who sponsors this, and my darling wife, Eula. I thought I would mention something that is rather important and very underreported in the news. First, let's talk about who is going to be giving us the information that I'm about to read. This is Mr. John L. Casey. He is president of the Space and Science Research Corporation, a leading climate science research organization. He is a former White House Space Program Advisor, NASA headquarters and congressional consultant, and space shuttle engineer. He is a leading researcher on the science of solar activity cycles and their impacts on climate change and associated catastrophic geophysical events, including earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. And he is the author of the widely acclaimed climate science book, Cold Sun. So the person who we're about to hear from is very qualified. And if you're a good judge of character and have a good, what they might say, gut or spiritual instinct, you can discern in looking into someone's eyes, even if it's in a video over the internet, and their mannerisms, whether or not they're a competent person, whether or not they're sincere and truth-telling. And I believe he falls into all of those categories as well. Here's what he has to say, that the sun has ended global warming. Now, I've lived in the same place for several decades, and I can tell you that when I first lived here, it snowed about 3 or 4 times a winter. And then it gradually snowed less and less and less over the following 3 decades. And then just starting with the last winter, it has started to snow again. So there was definitely a global warming period, and now that period has come to an end. Now, the issue is, well, what is the cause of it? We all know that automobiles and factories and things like that do pollute the atmosphere, and they do block out some of the sun, which you think would cause a little global cooling, but somehow the chemicals heat it up and so forth. And I'm not saying that that is not true, and neither is this gentleman here. The main criticism of the global warming is that it has become politicized and a commercial exploitive, like the former vice president finally admitted and grudgingly before Congress that he actually has shareholder interest in the company that's going to sell, quote, carbon credits. And what carbon credits really are simply giving people bribes to break the law. For example, let's say some company in China is making, plastics, and they're over their limit for polluting the air. What they can do is pay another company who is, less polluting, and then they're given permission to pollute the air more. So what that really boils down to in this vice president's money-making scheme is that if you bribe people with money, then you can break the law and pollute the planet more. And that's what carbon credits has to do with, which is pretty sad. But getting back to this topic, even though many who promote the mainstream view that the Earth is still on a warming trend, climate expert John Casey tells Newsmax TV that warming trend is over. And the sun is the culprit, not carbon emissions. Just to keep in mind, the sun is 1 million times bigger than the Earth in volume. So if you can imagine, a huge circle, and the tiniest little microscopic dot within that would be the sun. So, would be the Earth within the sun, if the big circle were the sun there. So what we're saying is that if anything, in the world, universe, solar system, whatever, was going to affect climate change, I think looking at the sun might be a pretty good idea. Seeing how its surface temperatures are 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit at the coldest, and again, it's 1,000,000 times bigger in volume than the Earth. And the amount of automobiles and factories are a fraction of the volume of the Earth. And of course, again, the sun is 1,000,000 times the volume of the entire planet. So, this guy is saying we need to look at the sun as the primary cause of weather on Earth. Let's continue. This is actually a pretty straightforward scientific proposition. The sun goes through natural cycles, and currently a 206-year cycle of the sun has ended global warming and has begun to institute a new cold climate period by cutting back that energy by which it warms the planet. Casey, president of the Space and Science Research Corporation, told J.D. Hayworth and Miranda Kahn on America's Forum on Thursday. We'll continue the article here. Now, of course, he has detractors with any new theory. It says Dr. Richard A. Mueller, senior scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, has said, according to his measurements, that solar activity does not affect climate change, which is pretty interesting. This, entity, 1,000,000 times bigger than the Earth and super, super hot, that the whole Earth is warmed by, that does not affect the climate of the Earth. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? And he considers himself a scientist. Casey said the UN dismissed the role of the sun in climate change decades ago by using the same kind of logic. The illogic is if you use only one parameter of the sun, the TSI or total solar irradiance, and you use that measurement, we find out that the TSI does in fact vary only a very small percentage. Thank goodness, because if it varied more, we'd probably all be dead. The variance of the percentage is only 1%. But we're talking about 1% of something that is 1,000,000 times bigger than the Earth. So 1% is 10,000 units of that. However, what we know after decades of research is that the Earth not only lives in a Goldilocks zone, that means the, good distance from the sun that's not too hot and not too cold, like Goldilocks' porridge, but lives on the knife's edge of that Goldilocks zone. So in this band of where life could exist in the planet, the Earth is actually on the very far side closest to the sun of it. In fact, if it were just 4% closer to the sun, we would have no life on Earth. So because it's already at that very close margin of the habitable zone, that's why 1% matters so much, in addition to it being 1% of something that's 1,000,000 times bigger than the Earth. He goes on to say, even that very small fraction of 1% of energy output from the sun makes the complete difference between a global warm period and a new little ice age, he said. However, the climate experts said that mankind's CO2 contribution does add to global warming, or it used to when we had global warming, meaning global warming was true, but it will no longer be starting now. It, however, is such a very small component, CO2, mankind emissions, it's almost insignificant, Casey contends. In fact, in our global climate status report that our scientists put together every 6 months, we measure 24 climate parameters, and CO2 is not even one of them, he added. That nature and the sun and various things affect the Earth much more. Casey, who has worked as a consultant for NASA, and was a White House Space Program advisor, is the author of Dark Winter, How the Sun is Causing a 30-Year Cold Spell, in which he argues that the planet is undergoing a cooling trend. Now, he is backed up by other scientists as well. It says the Earth is facing a prospect of a mini ice age, according to Professor Zarakova. Sunspot activity is likely to fall, similar to what took place during the Marauder Minimum or the Little Ice Age. This will culminate in drastic drops in temperature and more winter-like conditions. Zarakova observed that solar activity had a significant influence on past climate trends. During the Little Ice Age that lasted close to 2 centuries, sunspot activity was low and temperatures plunged throughout the northern hemisphere. Winters were more pronounced and the summers were unconvincing at best. We will see it from 2020 to 2053, when the next 3 cycles will be very reduced magnetic field of the sun. Basically what happens is these 2 waves, and she goes on into an explanation of it. Here was the first part of it here. You know, the title is While the World Debates Global Warming, a Physicist Warns of the Coming Ice Age. And the first part of it says, while a significant number of people and world leaders are concerned about global warming, a renowned solar physicist has come up with a theory that is entirely contradictory. Professor Valentina Zurakova, a solar physicist at UK's Northumbria University, claims that the Earth is, in fact, not warming up any longer, but cooling down. She has been conducting extensive research on sunspots, ominously cooler regions of the sun's surface characterized by intense magnetic activity, pivotal and influencing climate patterns. According to some researchers, the current increase in global temperatures is a result of increased sunspot activity rather than the emission of greenhouse gases. And then it goes on to say that sunspot activity that caused global warming is now retracting, and that's what's going to cause more severe winters in the near future. And in fact, here is an account of this. Remember, John Casey said that it was a 206-year cycle of the sun that goes through its, extreme warmest period to coldest period, and we're about to enter that coldest period. It says the year is 1816, right? That's 200 years ago. He's talking about a 200-year cycle. 206 year is estimate, known as the year without summer. And it says summer, also known as the year of poverty, or poverty year, the summer that never was. These are other titles, that nicknamed that particular year. There was no summer. 1,800 people froze to death because of severe climate abnormalities that caused average global temperatures to decrease by, this is a very small amount, seemingly, 0.4 to 0.7 degrees Celsius, or 0.7 to 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, it's a very fine edge. If you're balancing, Earth is, barely in this perfect position to harbor life. When you just go 1% the other direction, you can have dramatic domino effects. It says this resulted in major food shortages across the northern hemisphere. Evidence suggests that the anomaly was predominantly a volcanic winter event caused by the massive 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in the Dutch East Indies, the largest eruption in at least 1,300 years after the extreme weather events 535, 536. The Earth had already been in a centuries-long global cooling that started in the late 14th century, today known as the Little Ice Age. Basically, it says a year without summer was an agricultural disaster. Historian John D. Post has called this the last great sustenance crisis in the Western world. The unusual climate aberrations of 1816 had the greatest effect on most of New England, Atlantic Canada, and parts of Western Europe. Again, this is what Casey is saying is going to happen in the very near future, perhaps starting this year. So, if you live in these areas, take note. Typically, the late spring and summer of central and northern New England and southeastern Canada are relatively stable. But it says in North America, the spring and summer of 1816, a persistent dry fog was observed in parts of the eastern U.S. The fog reddened and dimmed the sunlight, that sunspots were visible to the naked eye. Neither wind nor rainfall dispersed the fog. It had been characterized at a stratospheric sulfate aerosol veil. At higher elevations, where farming was problematic in good years to begin with, the cooler climate did not quite support agriculture. In May 1816, frost killed off most crops in the higher elevations of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont, as well as upstate New York. On June, summertime, snow fell in Albany, New York, and Dennisville, Maine. Many commented on the phenomenon. Sarah Schnell Bryant of Cummington, Massachusetts, wrote in her diary that the weather was backwards. So this is what we have to expect in our near future. At the church family of Shakers in upstate New York, near New Lebanon, Nicholas Bennett wrote in May 1816, all was froze and the hills were barren like winter. This is during the summer. Temperatures went below freezing almost every day in May. The ground froze solid in June 9th. June 12th, the Shakers had to replant their crops, destroyed by the cold. In July, it was so cold that everything stopped growing. And there was frost in August, which was supposed to be the warmest month of the year. Now, here's a letter John Casey wrote to FEMA about this coming cooling temperatures. And it not only is this sunspot cycle associated with colder temperatures, it also is associated with an increase in earthquakes. Now, you remember what we read in Wikipedia about the year without summer, blamed it on a volcano. Well, that's kind of, both are true. It's the sunspot lack of activity that, for whatever reason, has a pattern of triggering more earthquakes, which triggers more volcanoes, which puts ash in the upper atmosphere, which blocks the sun, which makes temperatures around the world, as that ash circulates around the world, cooler. So you have the sun being cooler, causing global cooling, and then you have it triggering more earthquakes, which triggers volcanoes, which puts ash up in the atmosphere, which circles the globe, which also causes global cooling. But let's talk about how the sunspot cycle, the 206-year cycle, is likely to cause more earthquakes. He's writing to FEMA. He says, Mr. Fugate, please accept my thanks for all you and FEMA have done over the years in responding to natural disasters. This letter addresses another impending set of geophysical disasters. Our research, to be published on June 10th, 2015, suggests a high probability for catastrophic earthquakes or volcanic eruptions in all the major seismic and volcanic regions of the United States has increased significantly. We believe the U.S. and the world has now entered the most dangerous period for catastrophic earthquakes and volcanic eruptions in over 200 years. In fact, a new trend of increased number of intensity of earthquakes and volcanoes globally has already started and is generating serious concern in the geology field. This increased threat level warning we are issuing is intimately linked to an ongoing dramatic reduction in the energy output of the sun. These events, tracked primarily by sunspot counts, are called solar minimums, or more descriptively, solar hibernations. Analysis of past climate changes have also demonstrated that when these changes in the sun happen, the Earth descends into a long, deep, cold climate period. These periods are universally understood within the solar physics community. Our previous research indicated the start of the next solar hibernation is now, confirmed by NASA. Therefore, we believe the well-known high-risk seismic zones and volcanically active regions in the United States, especially California, South Carolina, and in particular, the New Madrid seismic zone, may experience major quakes or volcanism at any time between now and the early 2030s, when the bottom of the next solar hibernation is reached. In the case of the New Madrid seismic zone, we show that each of the last 4 solar hibernations had a catastrophic earthquake at that region when it began. Now that a new solar hibernation period has begun, we should take maximum precautions given the high probability that another devastating earthquake will soon strike the New Madrid zone. That's kind of near Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi River area. The window of opportunity for the next major earthquake is between 2017 and 2038. It is understandable that this letter may be difficult to accept, given the scale of the problem and the political and scientific establishment barriers that you will encounter should you take decisive action as requested. However, before you reject this message, I strongly urge that you thoroughly examine our research conclusions and recommendations for preparing for what we expect to be a period of unparalleled geophysical lethality and destruction. So, there you have it. Now, let's move on to here, and let's look at what happened in the New Madrid earthquake. Now, remember, he said it was a 206-year cycle. So, if you add 206 years to 1811, you get 2017. Oh, that's next year. That's in a few months, right? It says the 1812, 11 through 12 New Madrid earthquakes, there were more than one, and they were all greater than 7 on the Richter scale, and some believe 8 or slightly higher. There were series beginning with an initial earthquake of 7.5 or not through 9. These are estimated because they're 200-year-old scientific equipment. On December 16th, 1811, followed by a moment magnitude 7.4 aftershock. The aftershock was 7.4. That's another major earthquake. People don't understand on this Richter scale, every time you go up a magnitude of 1 point, it's actually 10 times greater, meaning that a 7.0 earthquake is 10 times greater than a 6.0. Not, 10% greater, 10 times greater, right? 1,000% greater. So the difference between a 7.0 and an 8.0 is 1,000%. An 8.0 would be 10 times more powerful than a 7.0, right? They remain the most powerful earthquakes to hit the continuous United States east of the Rocky Mountains in recorded history. And here's kind of the area here of where they happened. But they were so severe that they rang church bells in Boston, which is north of New York State, in case your New England geography is a little rusty, as mine is from being in public schools for all those years. Basically, that's when they happened. And here's the, more details. On December 16th, 205 years ago, there was a 7.5 through 7.9. Later on that day, there was another 7.4. So that's 2 extremely high earthquakes. Then a 7.3 through a 7.6, right? So how many is that so far? 1, 2, 3. There's 4 earthquakes on the same fault line, somewhere between 7 and as high as 8 within just a couple of months of one another. And so this is a pretty big problem if you're living in the area. Now here's the interesting thing about anything, whether you debate that Planet X is real, or whether Jesus is the Messiah, or whether the moon landings are real. There's always people who say, one thing and they say the exact opposite. But we have to remember that throughout recorded history, the majority has always been wrong. The majority thought the earth was flat. The majority thought bleeding blood from you would cure you if you had a virus. And so we have to see the retractor side too. Here's the retractor side of these earthquakes having to do with the solar activity being reduced, somehow triggering greater earthquakes, as this gentleman who used to consult the White House and NASA used to say. Or here's what this article says. If you think there have been more earthquakes than usual this year, you're right. A new study finds there were more than twice as many big earthquakes in the first quarter of 2014 as compared with the average since 1979. We have recently experienced a period that has had one of the highest rates of earthquakes ever recorded, said lead study author Tom Parsons, a research geophysicist with the U.S. Geological Survey in Menlo Park, California. But even though the global earthquake rate is on the rise by 100%, the number of quakes can still be explained by random chance. Well, to me, that's just funny. That's like saying crime in Chicago, doubled from last year. Or, I don't know, the price of potatoes, doubled from last year. And it's just a coincidence. No, if potatoes doubled in price from last year, there's a reason for it. And if crime doubled in one city in 1 year, there's a reason for it. Fewer police, less morality, something. So because earthquakes are doubling in 1 year, it's, there's a reason for it. And John apparently is a little bit deeper thinker and able to comprehend those reasons why. Let's take a quick look at a map of rivers, and I bring this up because here, basically the Mississippi River, they believe, was formed by the New Madrid Fault. It basically is the fault line. Some believe if you have another great series of earthquakes like that, which 200 years ago formed these lakes called Reelfoot Lakes in Tennessee, that the Great Lakes up here through this river connection could flood down here the Mississippi River. And so all this tremendous amount of water equal to a small ocean in the Great Lakes over here could flood these rivers. It would open up the Mississippi River, maybe 50, 100 miles wide, and flood a lot of southern Mississippi, maybe half of Louisiana, and a good part of southeastern Texas. That's the possibility of this. Now, here's something very interesting. If you're not a subscriber to BP Earthwatch on YouTube, I highly recommend it. He brought this to my attention. Now, I have studied this before in regard to Janet Napolitano saying the day she resigned, a natural disaster, the likes of which the United States has never before seen, is likely on its way. And then she went on to say that that's the reason why she's resigning, so she didn't have to deal with it. Now, I knew at that time that Obama had passed several executive orders having to do with who is like ninth in succession of the Department of Transportation, which I thought was kind of weird. Why do you need to go that far down in the Department of Transportation? Well, they're getting things in order. Again, if you see your neighbor suiting up with an umbrella, rain boots, and a raincoat, even though it's sunny outside, you say to yourself, maybe he knows something that I don't, and maybe a storm is coming. Well, look what Obama just signed, in addition to the ones I knew about 2 years ago, on August 12th, executive orders providing an order of succession within the Department of Treasury, within the Department of Veteran Affairs, within the Department of Environmental Protection Agency, because they forgot to do these, you see, 2 years ago when they did the other ones. And let's read the order, and it tells you exactly what's going on here. It says the reason they're writing this law is so that if both the Secretary and Deputy Secretary, or also known as Undersecretary of the Treasury, have died, resigned, or otherwise unable to perform their functions of duties, the office of Secretary, the succession of who's in charge can continue. So what they're saying is that all at one time, these three positions right here, the Treasury, Veterans, Environmental Protection Agency, with all the ones they did 2 years ago, they're very concerned that these top officials are all going to die or resign at the same time, because now they're writing laws that when and if that happens, more like when it happens, who will be in charge, and through the succession of up to 9 times, I think it was in the last executive order. So I believe that this clearly points to some event in the very near future, whether it be, man-made or geological, or maybe even a comet, asteroid, or meteor storm from outer space, is going to cause the dysfunctioning of the government to such a degree that the executive branch has to write these orders, who is in charge of all these agencies, if the top people die or resign. So they have to be expecting that these people are dying or going to resign in the future. Otherwise, they wouldn't be writing these laws to take care of that eventuality. That speaks for itself. Let's take a look at this scripture. This is Jesus talking, and Jesus, if you believe, was the Messiah, God's regent, Son of earth, and that he knew all things, co-creator of the universe, and he would know in the future. The Bible says the only entity that knows the future is God and his prophets. So there you go. He said, for nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be earthquakes, or an increase thereof, in various places. And there shall be famines and troubles, probably caused by those events. These are the beginning of sorrows. So, let's go to another one in Revelation. It says, when the sixth seal was opened, John the prophet, in a vision, he says he beheld, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black, like maybe a rogue planet blocking it, and sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell upon the earth, even as a fig tree casts its unripe figs. This is a potentiality. is that there's a meteor shower coming. Now, if it were a single asteroid or comet, the governments of the world could launch nuclear missiles out into space just a few miles ahead of those objects, explode, create a shock wave that would push them enough off target to not hit the Earth. But if a meteor storm is coming, if the stars of heaven are going to fall to the Earth, right? It says right here, as the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as a fig tree casting it ripe twigs, falling stars. If there's a meteor storm coming, there would be tens of thousands of meteors at the same time, and that would be extremely devastating, and there would be not enough missiles to blow those up from hitting the earth. It goes on to say, and the heavens departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their place. Some believe by the earthquakes, get rid of the mountains, and their tidal waves, which they cause, get rid of the islands, and how they're moved out of their place. Then it says, and the kings of the earth, and their great men, and the rich men, and the generals, and the mighty men, and every slave, and every free man, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains. And sure enough, the government is opening up all these Cold War bunkers like Cheyenne Mountain, and they're building underground, bunkers for the elite, the rich people, the government officials, for apparently some thing that is going to happen in the near future. This has been Brother Bart's Conspiracy Corner News, episode 36. Even though I'm suggesting you be prepared for now, the greater question is, are you prepared for eternity? Please tell your friends, share the link. Give me a YouTube thumbs up if you like this video. Check out my new Facebook fan page, linked in the description of this video. Like it if you like it. And be sure to read the full Sleuth Journal article on this topic, also linked in the description of this video. And most of all, thank you for your kind and generous support. Greetings, friends and countrymen. Welcome to Conspiracy Corner News, episode 36. This is Bart Sabrell. Conspiracy Corner News briefly highlights the week's most significant and underreported news events throughout the world, focusing on special preparation for the difficult times ahead for all mankind. Thank you again to all my PayPal donators out there, Simon and John, Brett, Andy, James and Ralph, Joseph, Patricia, Graham, Adam, Romerico, Chris, Robert, Russ, Donald, Golden T, Snowman, and Elaine. And of course, the Sleuth Journal, who sponsors this, and my darling wife, Eula. I thought I would mention something that is rather important and very underreported in the news. First, let's talk about who is going to be giving us the information that I'm about to read. This is Mr. John L. Casey. He is president of the space. Here's what he has to say, that the sun has ended global warming. Now, I've lived in the same place for several decades, and I can tell you that when I first lived here, it snowed about 3 or 4 times a winter. And then it gradually snowed less and less and less over the following 3 decades. And then just starting with the last winter, it has started to snow again. So there was definitely a global warming period, and now that period has come to an end. Now, the issue is, well, what is the cause of it? We all know that automobiles and factories and things like that do pollute the atmosphere, and they do block out some of the sun, which you think would cause a little global cooling, but somehow the chemicals heat it up and so forth. And I'm not saying that that is not true, and neither is this gentleman here. The main criticism of the global warming is that it has become politicized and a commercial exploitive, like the former vice president finally admitted and grudgingly before Congress that he actually has shareholder interest in the company that's going to sell, quote, carbon credits. And what carbon credits really are simply giving people bribes to break the law. For example, let's say some company in China is making, plastics, and they're over their limit for polluting the air. What they can do is pay another company who is, less polluting, and then they're given permission to pollute the air more. So what that really boils down to in this vice president's money-making scheme is that if you bribe people with money, then you can break the law and pollute the planet more. And that's what carbon credits has to do with, which is pretty sad. But getting back to this topic, even though many who promote the mainstream view that the Earth is still on a warming trend, in Science Research Corporation, a leading climate science research organization, he is a former White House Space Program Advisor, NASA headquarters and congressional consultant, and space shuttle engineer. He is a leading researcher on the science of solar activity cycles and their impacts on climate change and associated catastrophic geophysical events, including earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. And he is the author of the widely acclaimed climate science book, Cold Sun. So the person who we're about to hear from is very qualified, and if you're a good judge of character and have a good, what they might say, gut or spiritual instinct, you can discern in looking into someone's eyes, even if it's in a video over the internet, and their mannerisms, whether or not they're a competent person, whether or not they're sincere and truth-telling, and I believe he falls into all of those categories as well. And climate expert John Casey tells Newsmax TV that warming trend is over. And the sun is the culprit, not carbon emissions. Just to keep in mind, the sun is 1 million times bigger than the Earth in volume. So if you can imagine, a huge circle, and the tiniest little microscopic dot within that would be the sun. So, would be the Earth within the sun, if the big circle were the sun there. So what we're saying is that if anything, in the world, universe, solar system, whatever, was going to affect climate change, I think looking at the sun might be a pretty good idea. Seeing how its surface temperatures are 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit at the coldest, and again, it's 1 million times bigger in volume than the Earth. And the amount of automobiles and factories are a fraction of the volume